Is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to be recognized to address you here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives and to carry on some of the discussion that's taking place around this city and around this country today on March for Life Day. It would take you back 45 years ago on January 22nd, 1973, when the case of Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton came before our United States Supreme Court. And they manufactured a legal opinion out of the emanations and penumbras, to quote the decision, that resulted in abortion on demand in this country. Some say abortions soared up to as many as 6 million a year in some of those years in the 70s. America wasn't ready for such a decision. And we didn't understand in 1973 the magnitude of the decision the Supreme Court had made. We knew that it was going to open up abortion. We suspected it would be abortion on demand. We did not expect that 45 years later, we would be here in this city still marching for life, and marching to defend the lives of the innocent unborn, and praying in most, if not every single church in America to defend innocent unborn human life. And some of the questions that have come before us in that period of time, as 2 generations of Americans have grown up with the guilt of abortion, with the shadow of it hanging over our heads, 2 generations of Americans have grown up having to answer this question: is human life sacred? Is it the value, is it the measure that we put up when we evaluate all things we do? Our founding fathers understood that when they laid out the original founding document of the Declaration of Independence. And they wrote that we have the unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, it's no coincidence that life is first in that list, Mr. Speaker. Our founding fathers understood that they were prioritized rights, that the right to life is paramount, and the right to life is sacred, but that liberty comes from God. He confers his God-given liberty on us, and we have to handle it responsibly. And behind that came pursuit of happiness. Now, I'll take it from the bottom up, Mr. Speaker. Pursuit of happiness was understood differently by our founders than I think we understand it today. It seems to me that if you go into a high school classroom who have been studying our founding documents, our Declaration and our Constitution and the Federalist Papers, and ask them what does pursuit of happiness means, they might say, well, a good tailgate party, or a fun time with your friends, or any one of a number of other things that they do for recreation. But truthfully, Mr. Speaker, that's not how our founding fathers looked at that pursuit of happiness. They didn't even call it the rich things that we draw from our families exclusively, but they understood pursuit of happiness as the term is understood in the Greek, which is the foundation for that term, and it's a word eudaimonia, spelled E-U-D-A-M-O-N-I-A. Eudaimonia. And eudaimonia is the breadth of the pursuit of happiness, described and understood properly as this: it's becoming the whole human being, the whole person, developing yourself physically with the God-given bodies that we have, with exercise and nutrition, and that's to develop our skill sets with the gifts that we have that are physical skills. And it includes also the intellectual component, where we develop our minds as far as we can, educate ourselves, and fill that God-given brain up with all of the information that's relevant and useful. That's the second component. And the third component is spiritual. They expected and called upon this pursuit of happiness, this eudaimonia, to become the effort to become a complete human being spiritually, intellectually, and physically. That was the package of eudaimonia, pursuit of happiness. But even that couldn't trump another individual's liberty, couldn't take aside the God-given liberty to live free and be free and have free movement and rights to property and a number of those components. So if our effort to pursue happiness can't trample on someone else's God-given liberty, we understand that. You can't take away somebody's property because it makes you happy. It's a pretty simple equation. Neither then can a pursuit of liberty be allowed to justify the taking of a human life, because life is the highest priority. And it was always prioritized life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, or in Burke's language, life, liberty, and property. But life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness was always prioritized with life as the highest priority that stands out above all else. And I would remind you, Mr. Speaker, that when you want to know a measure to how we measure, there's the meter, invented by a Frenchman, is set to be that 39-point-something inches, and they have a platinum meter stick that's set up so that they can have a finite measure that doesn't, they keep it in a controlled atmosphere so it doesn't expand or contract, and it's the most precise measurement of a meter. That's the basis for distance measuring in the metric world, most of the rest of the world. That's the best basis for distance measuring. That meter stick, that platinum meter stick, is the measure itself that they measure everything else against in components of or multiples of that meter stick. Well, I would take you to former governor of Pennsylvania, now passed away, and the father of Senator Bob Casey Sr. And he made this statement. He said, human life cannot be measured. It is the measure itself against which all other things are weighed. Now you hear the comparison that I've drawn. The meter stick is the measure itself of distance, but human life is a measure of all of our values. Human life is sacred, it is finite, and the value of life from the moment of conception until natural death is the same. We don't punish people differently when they commit murder against someone who is 101 years old versus someone who is 1 year old. Somebody that has perhaps a century of life ahead of them, we don't say their life is worth more than someone that almost certainly doesn't have a decade of life ahead of them. Because human life is sacred, and it is the measure itself against which all other things are weighed. And so once we understand that human life is sacred in all of its forms, there's only one other question to ask, and that is, at what moment does life begin? At what instant does life begin? And we can look through this whole period of human development, and we can make arguments about viability and trimesters and ability to breathe or live outside the womb, and those things are always vague. You can never nail that down to anything precise, because even the personhood, even the pain-capable legislation that we passed out of this House a couple of months ago, that's what we call it 20-week, that bans abortions after 20 weeks, we say that baby can feel pain at 20 weeks. So that is abhorrent to our conscience, and we reject aborting a baby that can feel pain. We don't know whether they can feel pain prior to that or not. But that's not a precise moment. It's a relatively vague moment that is a consensus conclusion of OBGYN doctors, perhaps. But life itself cannot be measured, and neither can we take that life and say, well, we might not have. And I've often stood in a high school or even a middle school gymnasium and talked to the youth in there whose ears and minds are open. And I say, if someone walked by the door of this gymnasium and looked away from you and poked a gun in the door and pulled the trigger, did he kill somebody? And they look at each other and they go, well, we don't know. And I said, neither does he. But if there's somebody laying there in the bleachers that is dead, then what happened? Then we know he killed somebody. I said, well, can you take a chance with that? Is he guilty of murder if he poked a gun in the door and the crowd was full and he pulled the trigger and somebody died? Yes. So neither can we take a chance with innocent unborn human life and say it really isn't a life prior to 20 weeks, or it really isn't a life prior to viability, or really isn't a life until the third trimester. So what we've done in this Congress is we've brought a number of pieces of legislation, incremental pieces of legislation, to try to put an end to this killing, because we know and believe the pro-life community, all of the pro-life community is convinced that life begins at that moment of conception, that instant of conception. And we have to protect that life from that moment. And anybody that's picked up a little baby, especially if it's your own, and in awe at the miracle of this little child created in God's image from the DNA of mom and dad, to be nurtured and shaped, to live, to love, to learn, to laugh, to to worship, to have children of his or her own, understands that miracle and how precious it is to us. And there are at least 500,000 couples in America that are waiting to adopt because they want a baby to love so badly. And yet, we've watched as 60 million babies have been aborted since 1973. In the last 45 years, 60 million babies, weighing on the conscience of America, a sin committed by the government of our country. There's been people complicit in this that have advocated for it. And just a little bit ago, we had the vote on the Born Alive bill here on the floor that enhances the penalty if an abortionist isn't successful on the first try. What they often do is put that baby in a cold room and close the door and let that baby die in that cold room. There are other more ghastly methods that get used as well. So we move legislation here on the floor to statutorily protect that baby that survives the abortion. And in essence, what it really in the end it says is this, that if you try to end the life of this baby through abortion and fail, we're going to punish you if you need a second try. I don't think it's nearly enough. I think it's a start, but it's not nearly enough. And actually, we need to be accelerating our pace in incrementalism, not taking our foot off the throttle on the incremental approach to ending abortion. 45 years, 2 generations, 60 million babies. And I'm glad we have passed the legislation that protects a born alive baby from being killed by the abortionist. I'm glad we did that today. But we should not see it as a premier piece of legislation that's going to end even one abortion. Instead, it might end some of the killing post-abortion. So it says something about our defense of life, but it doesn't say nearly enough about our defense of life. And through the time that I've been here in this pro-life movement in Iowa and here in this Congress, 2 decades more altogether, I've gone from trying to get legislation passed that required that if a young mother was seeking an abortion, a minor mother was seeking an abortion, that she needed to have parental notification. That was about all we could get back when I started on this in 1996. And even then they named notify a parent. And even then they named that parent as, defined the parent as, well, she can notify a mom or a dad, a stepmom or a stepdad, a grandparent, a grandfather, a grandmother, an aunt, an uncle, a brother or a sister, and the whole or half blood. That's how Planned Parenthood lobbied to define this parent that would be notified that this child mother was going to get an abortion. It's still not parental consent in my state, but instead it's parental notification with this long list of what a parent is. A father, a mother, a guardian, a legal guardian, those are okay. Then grandparents, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, and the whole or half blood. And I said, you left out the neighbor, the family cat, or the family dog. Couldn't you just name everything as a parent? Maybe you could seal an envelope up and put it in a safe deposit box and they could open up the archives in 100 years and that would be the notice for all the impact they had. They did everything to restrict anything that might protect an innocent unborn baby. That's what it was like in '96 for me in my state. And so through that time, we've marched through this march of incrementalism. Prior to that, God bless Henry Hyde, from where I stand and from the floor of this House, time after time, he stood up and he defended life. And the Hyde Amendment, along with Mexico City policy, over the effect of these years, these many years along the way, has cumulatively saved somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 million lives. Now that sounds like a big number, 2 million lives. And it makes me feel good about Henry Hyde. And I recall going to his funeral and saying goodbye to Henry. And I know that if there's anybody that's stood here and talked at the podium that's in heaven, it's Henry Hyde. The #1 pro-life activist, effective worker here as a former chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. He used the tools of his job and his character and his faith to save roughly 2 million lives. And then I try to figure out, okay, how many others did we save with the incrementalism that we had? And I was involved in the effort. And I want to tip my hat to Steve Shabbat, who was the chairman of the Constitution Committee at that time when I came to this Congress. And we had partial birth abortion ban. And that went out, that was passed off this Congress and written into law. But they litigated that to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court came down and turned it down in a decision that said you can't ban partial birth abortion because that procedure is written too vaguely within the law. So the physician, put that in quotes, the physician can't determine exactly what's lawful and what isn't. And on top of that, we hadn't determined that a partial birth abortion is never necessary to save the life of the mother. So we went back to work. And we rewrote that legislation to conform with the Supreme Court's no decision. And we precisely defined the ghastly act of partial birth abortion in law. We held multiple hearings, and through the course of that, we established congressional findings that a partial birth abortion was never medically necessary to save the life of the mother. So we answered both of the Supreme Court's objections, and that went back out again where it was litigated through the 3 circuits that were converged in before the Supreme Court, and I was part of that. And I sat through one of those cases in Lincoln, Nebraska, and then came to hear the case here in the United States Supreme Court as well, and there we prevailed. Now, I don't know how many lives we've saved with the ban on partial birth abortion. They'll find another way to abort that baby. But at least we put another principle in place. We're still stuck at about 2 million babies saved over the course of 45 years. And I look at some of the other legislation we passed out of the House, but not the Senate. And the Senate's blocking, Senate Democrats are blocking piece after piece of legislation. But a couple of months ago, we passed the legislation over to the Senate that is, we call it pain capable, of the 20-week abortion ban. And that legislation is a legislation I mentioned a few minutes ago, that we've determined that a baby can feel pain. We have evidence of them squirming and struggling to get away from the surgeon's tools. We've got the testimony of abortionists that tell us how a baby struggles and exhibits pain. And many of you, I believe, Mr. Speaker, have seen the surgery that was being conducted on about a 7-month-old baby, and the incision that went through into the womb, and that baby reached outside his mother's womb and held the finger of the surgeon. That picture will be in my mind forever. We can't think that a baby that can grasp the finger of a surgeon 2 months before he is born is not a human being and not a human life. Of course they are. So we in this House banned abortion after 20 weeks under the definition that they're capable of feeling pain. That's a step in the right direction. And it's a pretty big chunk of incrementalism as well that goes further than maybe anything that has come off the floor of this House so far. We also have legislation waiting here that is pieces of incrementalism. But the Born Alive legislation that passed this morning here is incrementalism, and it's a small incrementalism that actually doesn't stop a single abortion, but does put a statement down on the value of that baby. Then there's legislation here that is legislation that prohibits sex-selected abortion, because we're seeing that now with ultrasound you can determine at an early stage whether it's a boy or whether it's a girl. And we have people that believe that, well, I think I'll abort the girl because I want my first child to be a boy. I'll take my chances the next time. How do you do that? How do you do that? If you believe that human life is sacred in all of its forms, how can you take the life of a little baby and say, I don't want this child to be the sibling to my next child because it's a girl instead of a boy, or, and less often, a boy instead of a girl? We know what that's done statistically in China, where they're down to one-child policy in China, which they've just lifted to some degree. And you have family after family that will abort any pregnancy that's not a boy because they want a boy to carry on the name. I have now passed away a former constituent named Gil Copper. Gil Copper was one of Merrill's marauders that fought down out of the Asian subcontinent in the Second World War. And for a while he was stationed in India, and there under the Ganges River that goes through New Delhi, or Delhi, India, and I believe that's the river, but he would go down and wait under that bridge, especially towards evening. And he would just stand in the water, say up to here, and he'd listen and watch and listen for the splash. And when he heard the splash, he knew what brought that about. The splash was many, many times a little girl baby that was being thrown off the bridge into the river because they didn't want a little girl. And Gil Copper would swim out there in that dirty river and get a hold of that little baby and bring that baby and swim back to shore with that baby and dry that baby off, get that baby breathing, and carry that baby down to the orphanage and start that baby's life there. He saved dozens and dozens of little girl babies by posting himself in that river in India as a warrior defending our freedom in the Second World War. And he became a pro-life activist. He already was. He came back to America a pro-life activist. And I want to do all we can to support his sacrifice and in his memory, and in Henry Hyde's, and in Joe Pitt's, and in Chris Smith, and in Trent Franks. That's the names of the people that have led on this issue since I've been in this Congress and before. All of them deserve a special place in all of our heads and hearts for the work that they have done. But we're at a place now where the pieces of legislation that have come through this House of Representatives and have been sent to the Senate, or are poised to come through this House and sent to the Senate, now comes down in the House to this. We have the bill that prohibits sex-selected abortion. And let's see, we have no sex-selected abortion, and pain-capable legislation is already passed. So, and then Chris Smith has legislation that prohibits abortion on the dismemberment. And to describe this, Mr. Speaker, is also ghoulish and ghastly. And that is the process of the dismemberment abortion, where the surgeon reaches in with specially made forceps and grips a part of a baby and pulls. And we had a doctor who had been committed, I don't know how many thousands of abortions, describe this before the Judiciary Committee, and pull with a very strong force, pull hard, and come out with an arm or a leg or a part of a torso, and arrange those pieces in a stainless steel pan to see if he got all the pieces of the baby that he was tearing apart. Chris Smith's legislation stops that ghastly process. It doesn't end abortion, but it ends the ghastly process of dismemberment abortion. And I support that legislation. In fact, I have signed on to every piece of pro-life legislation that's come through this House of Representatives, unless I just missed one somewhere. I believe it's every single one. But as I watch this incrementalism take place, I've always looked for, when do the stars align themselves right? How do we get to this place where we do what we know is true and right and just? When will it be aligned right? And the alignment, we've known this for 45 years. We can save these lives, those who we aborted in the future, we can save them if we have a pro-life majority in the House of Representatives that's willing to take action. And if we have a pro-life majority in the United States Senate that can figure out how to get past the 60-vote filibuster rule. And if we have a president that will sign the legislation, and if we have a Supreme Court that will uphold that legislation. 4 windows, Mr. Speaker, 4 windows we need to have open. And they almost have to be open, they have to be open in sequence, and they have to be open at the right time. So today, we have a pro-life majority in the House of Representatives ready to move, if we can get it to the floor, any reasonable piece of pro-life legislation that's consistent with the philosophy that I've articulated here in the last half hour. The House is ready. The Senate has a pro-life majority. They don't have yet a way to get past that 60-vote threshold of the filibuster. Except, all Mitch McConnell needs to do is go out there and make a motion to amend the rule, and by suspending or deleting the filibuster rule. And that can pass by a simple majority in the United States Senate. So all he needs is 51 votes, and I'll bet you Mike Pence would fly back from the Middle East to cast that 51st vote if it meant opening up the door to save these lives and put an end to the discretion of aborting babies because they happen to be inconvenient or for other purposes. So the House is ready. The Senate has a pro-life majority. They've got to get past the filibuster. The president will sign legislation to save lives, and he's giving a speech maybe about now talking about the value of innocent unborn human life. We've never had such a pro-life president. We've never had, and I have to say this twice, we've never had such a pro-life vice president, Mike Pence, who sat next to me on my elbow on the Judiciary Committee for, I believe it was 10 years. And I understand his convictions, and I know what he'll be saying to the president. I understand the president's convictions. We need to get legislation to the president's desk. What a tragedy if we failed to move when we had the chance to move. What a tragedy if we weren't bold when we had the opportunity to be bold. What a tragedy if we're stuck in the rut of incrementalism and this little dinky war of attrition that goes on between factions here within the House and within the Senate when we know what is the true right and just thing to do. But I've described how we have to be precise in the way we draft legislation that prohibits practices and prohibits abortion, along with other things. And we have to determine the rationale for our decisions here in the House and in the Senate. And so I drafted legislation a year and a half ago that's called the Heartbeat Protection Act. The Heartbeat Protection Act is H.R. 490, and it does this. It directs that if an abortionist is planning to commit an abortion, he must first check for a heartbeat. If a heartbeat can be detected, the baby is protected. That's the center of the legislation. It's only a few pages. It's not complex. We stripped it down so it was clean and everybody could understand it. And we define the check for the heartbeat to be within the parameters of modern medicine. We can determine a heartbeat. We know the heart will beat as early as 18 days, but it can be determined with confidence at about 6 weeks. So this is the 20-week bill is the pain capable. This heartbeat bill can be thought of in, say, roughly 6 weeks from conception. But our definition is the heartbeat, not any time frame. That heartbeat is precise. You can say then to the Supreme Court, we're not going to end the lives of these babies if their heart is beating. We can determine whether their heart is beating or not. 100% of the time that a baby's heart is beating, you've got a live baby. And so we know if we stop that beating heart, we've ended the life of a baby. It's really clear and simple. And it doesn't take a Rhodes Scholar to figure that out, even at the Supreme Court level. And it's within our hearts. And I look across the countryside and the miles and miles, thousands of miles that I've driven over the last 45 years. And each year I see more and more of the billboards up, many of them put up by the Knights of Columbus, that say, abortion stops a beating heart. Or, we all start small. They have gotten into our heads and into our conscience and into the culture of America. And when we see those billboards, we know what that says. It says, defend these little innocents. They might be the ones that produce the miracles going forward. Every one of them is a miracle. Every one of them created in God's image. But we know that abortion stops a beating heart. And we've all heard that rhythm of the ultrasound. We've all heard that sound of a beating heart. And if the rules didn't prohibit it, I would take out my iPhone and play this into the microphone, because I've got one of those glorious things that's really close to me in my iPhone right now, the beating of that little heart. 158 beats per minute, a healthy little child. And I've had them sent to me by constituents. They want me to listen, and they'll show me the ultrasound. And I have a district representative who framed the first ultrasound for his firstborn. And that little guy now, that frame has been in his office for all these years. That little guy now, his name is Joseph Dean Anderson, and he's 9 years old. And he's my godson. And his first picture is of his ultrasound. It's still framed, it's still cherished by his parents. And he is cherished by me. These lives are utterly precious. They're the future of our country. We're America today we have 102 million Americans who are of working age, simply not in the workforce. We're hearing debates here and in the Senate going on this week and next week and many weeks thereafter about how we don't have a workforce in America to do the work, so we have to go to foreign countries and bring people here that bring with them a different culture, which if they embrace ours is fine. They'll assimilate to Americanism. But we've got a large segment of America that is coaching them not to do that, to stick with the old ways rather than our ways. And there's a consequence to that. That's for another discussion another time, Mr. Speaker. But I'll submit this. 60 million babies aborted since Roe versus Wade in 1973. Roughly half of them were girls. And I went back through this decade by decade and did the math to calculate how many babies would those 30 million girls that would have grown by now, many of them into women, how many babies would they have had? And by my measure, and it's back of the envelope only, but it's all we really need to understand the concept, another 60 million. We're not only missing 60 million babies in this country that were aborted since Roe versus Wade, we're missing another 60 million babies that were not born because their mothers were aborted. And that way, now that's 120 million Americans are missing, and they weigh on our conscience. That's a third of our population. We're 320 million Americans. So I can say to a school auditorium, to two girls, two boys, or a boy and a girl, I say, you two look at each other. And they'll look at each other, and then I'll say, do you know what's missing? Your classmate, your friend, would be sitting between you now if it had not been for abortion. For every two we have, there's another one that would be sitting. Every two Americans we have, there's another one that would be sitting in between that would have needed a pair of shoes and a ball glove and maybe a dance contest costume. All the little things that come for little boys and girls, all the joy, all the laughter. Can you imagine shutting down a third of the laughter in a country? Or can you think about what America would be like if we were a country that we just stopped having babies? I mean, it's dialed down even worse in other countries, but that's where the joy and the laughter comes from. Without babies, there is no joy. Without babies, there is no laughter. It slowly silences itself as the years go by. If we had no more babies born in America, that means the 1 year old would be where we'd get the giggles and the laughs from. And they'd laugh and giggle for a few more years, and by the time they got into their 20s, that would diminish down some. And by the time they don't have any children, remember? They don't have children to love. And so their joy is going to be less. And as they get older, the hope would be gone, because what would you be preparing for except your own death? But we live for the next generation. And I want that next generation, all of them, to be born. I want them to live, to love, to learn, to laugh, to play, to work, to be parents, to have children of their own, to raise those siblings, broker the disagreements that come along with that, to develop themselves and feel how full you are when you're a person that's completely gifted by the blessings of children and grandchildren. But that's been snuffed out by short-sightedness because of the permissibility of the Supreme Court decision in 1973, Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton. And we're here in this town today marching from the mall to the Supreme Court building for I guess it'd be technically the 44th time. And what did we accomplish? Some things. We supported Henry Hyde. The Hyde Amendment in Mexico City policy has saved about 2 million lives. We banned partial birth abortion. We've passed a bill off the House of Representatives that bans abortion after 20 weeks when we believe that they are pain capable of suffering the grueling pain of an abortion. We've done that. But we sit here with the heartbeat bill. It is the strongest, best supported pro-life bill at this stage of it that has before the United States House of Representatives ever. Even pain capable came into the announcement that there would be a floor vote on it with about 151 or 153 signatures on it. The heartbeat bill that requires the abortionist to check for a beating heart, and if a heartbeat can be detected, the baby is protected, has today 170 co-sponsors on it. It has another good long list that say, I'm not ready to sign on, but you put it on the floor and I'll vote for it. We can pass that bill off the House of Representatives and send it over to the Senate. And if there are those that think, well, we don't want to let the heartbeat bill get ahead of the pain-capable bill, I don't know why we wouldn't do that. I think that's a better policy, actually, and anybody that wants to save lives ought to be for that. But if that's their decision, fine, the heartbeat bill can push the pain-capable bill out onto the floor of the Senate, and there can be a debate and a vote on pain-capable, the 20-week bill in the Senate. But there's no debate going on over there today. They don't have pro-life legislation moving through the United States Senate today. It's blocked up and balled up because they have a filibuster rule, and they're a little preoccupied, by the way. But if all this United States Congress can do on March for Life Day is to bring a bill that deals with post-abortion, born alive, save those babies, I'm glad we did it. We should have done another bill. We should have done the heartbeat bill here today. And, Mr. Speaker, the circumstances are this. The whip team for the heartbeat bill deserves a lot of credit. Janet Porter, Faith to Action, deserves a lot of credit. She's a driving force on this, Mr. Speaker. Our former whip and majority leader, Tom DeLay of Texas, has been working pro bono on this case for a long time, for a good year. He's been strategizing on that. He's been pulling votes together on it. And he's got his greatest regret as a now retired majority leader in the United States House of Representatives is that he wasn't able to end abortion while he was the leader here in this Congress. And his word to our leadership here and to all of us is, don't let this opportunity get away from you. This is the best opportunity. This is the best scenario. The window is open with a pro-life majority in the House, and it's open with a pro-life majority in the Senate. The President will sign the bill, and the Vice President will stand next to him and feeling good about it. And by the way, the Vice President and his wife Karen will probably hold hands and offer a prayer right before an act like that would happen. And the Supreme Court is poised for one or two more appointments to that Supreme Court. And, and those appointments being, I expect, consistent with President Trump's pledge that he will make those nominations out of the list that was produced by the Federalist Society and confirmed and supported by the Heritage Foundation and by me, by the way, and many other pro-life activists within this Congress and across this country. The selection that President Trump made out of those 21 potential justices to the Supreme Court was excellent. Neil Gorsuch couldn't have been, there's no better choice in my view. And one of the things I think it's important that goes into the congressional record is some, I'll say, very solidly confirmed back-channel information is this, that the White House interviewed all 20 or 21 of those potential, well, they were candidates for the Supreme Court. Out of those, they asked the same question, this same question of each one of them. And it was this, Mr. Speaker, if it's not going to be you as the nominee to the Supreme Court, who shall it be? Every other candidate, every other judge under consideration for appointment to become a Supreme Court justice, every other one said, if it's not to be me, it needs to be Neil Gorsuch. You could not get a higher endorsement on such a high-level position than that all of your peers that were in the running said, if it's not to be me, it needs to be Neil Gorsuch. We are going to be very happy with his process and his decisions that he makes for us, and I have a lot of reasons to have great confidence in him, but I offer that for consideration, Mr. Speaker. But our job here needs to be all we can do. When the window's open, we've got to go through that window. The window's open to pass the heartbeat bill now. 170 co-sponsors. We have 129 national organizations / leaders that support the heartbeat bill. It's about as close to unanimous across the entire movement in this country as it could possibly be. So with 170 co-sponsors and another high number of those who say, I'll vote for it, put it on the floor, the vast majority of the pro-life caucus wants it to come to the floor. The vast majority of the Values Action Team wants it to come to the floor. I actually don't know who the dissenters are here in the House that say it's a bad idea to have the heartbeat bill in law. There are a couple of people that disagree with the strategy, but they don't disagree with the policy, at least on this side of the aisle, Mr. Speaker. So, when the leadership tells the top pro-life organizations in the country, you must be unanimous in this and all of you on the same page, and when one organization says, I don't want to see this moved, then we have a problem. We have a problem because the will of the people needs to be reflected here in the House of Representatives. This is a Republican form of government by Constitution. The Constitution guarantees a Republican form of government, which means a representative form of government. That is, each one of us who will be elected here, we have a district of about 750,000 people. And it's our job to draw from them their best ideas and couple them with the principles that we have said we stand for, come here and bring those ideas into the House of Representatives, and then let those ideas out of 435 congressional districts compete against each other so that the best ideas rise to the top. The ideas that rise to the top need to be the ideas that have the most support. Not something that was pulled off the shelf and dropped in down here as in a bit of a token for something to do here on March for Life Day. What's the most important thing we can be doing? Saving innocent unborn human life. What's the highest priority we should have? The highest priority for the members of the House of Representatives. What pro-life bill has the most co-sponsors on it? By far, that's the heartbeat bill. And so why wasn't it on the floor here today, Mr. Speaker? Why not? And the reason is because I believe that there was shall I call it, an arrangement made by a previous speaker that pro-life legislation only moves when it's unanimously supported by the top 3 pro-life organizations in the country. And I will name them. And I count them all as people who have done a lot of good for this country. Family Research Council, Tony Perkins, a tremendous pro-life, pro-family warrior. And that's also true, we know, because his office has been targeted in the past, and they face violence down there in the entryway to his office. Tony doesn't blink. He's a former Marine. We've ridden the road together and been out there in those battles, and they are a strong, strong pro-life organization, one of the top 3. Susan B. Anthony lists, another one of the top 3. And that's led by Marjorie Dannenfelser, who has a terrific heart and very driven and awfully intelligent and a terrific memory about the components of the movement that have gone on. And her sidekick, I'll call her that, is an even closer friend, Marilyn Musgrave, whom I served here in the House of Representatives with for a good number of years. And she was a mentor to me, and she braced me up sometimes when I was trying to make sense of things that didn't make sense. And I count them as friends and pro-life warriors and terrific workers and people that are go-to people that I count on keeping things on the rails while I'm distracted with other things. But we're always on the same page together, almost always on the same page together, Mr. Speaker. The other organization is the National Right to Life. National Right to Life has been granted also a de facto veto power that the effect of it is to block a bill from coming to the floor of the House of Representatives. Now, I've said there are 129 organizations and leaders that have endorsed and or support the heartbeat bill, H.R. 490. There's only one that does not, and that's the National Right to Life. And that's led by Carol Tobias and David Osteen. And I've spoken with both of them at great length, not in person. I've been trying to get those kind of meetings, but it's been more effective. I've been trying to get those kind of meetings, but we spoke on the phone, Mr. Speaker. And with Carol Tobias, the president, before Christmas, a week or so before our Christmas break, about 45 minutes of intense discussion. And throughout all of that, she's insisted that they're not going to endorse the bill, they're not going to promote the bill, and I couldn't get her to move 1 inch, even though every other organization is on board. I couldn't get her to move 1 inch. She told me that they'd had a board meeting, it sounded to me like a couple of months earlier, and that nobody on the board supported the heartbeat bill. How big is that board? This is back channel. I'm told about 50. Can you imagine 50 pro-life activists sitting on the board of National Right to Life, and not one of them thinks that protecting a baby that has a detectable heartbeat is an endeavor that they want to support right now, when their mission statement says something entirely different? Well, that didn't seem right to me, and I hope there was another way to get this resolved. And I told her at the end of the conversation, I guess we've got a couple weeks before the tension starts to build, but I don't have many nice things I can do yet. And I don't think your advice is going to be to me to just give up and put the heartbeat bill in a drawer and say H.R. 490 was a nice try, but we came up short, so I guess it wasn't a good idea. How would I go to those 129 organizations and leaders and say to them, well, I think we'll just give up now because National Right to Life is not supporting our bill? Because Carol Tobias and 50 members of the board, presumably, and also David Osteen, don't think it's a good idea to move a heartbeat bill out of the House of Representatives. That they want to wait till the Supreme Court is ready to receive such a bill, apparently without calculating that it takes time to get legislation through the House and the Senate and to the President's desk. And it may not happen in this year. If we put the heartbeat bill on Mitch McConnell's desk in the Senate, it may not happen that the bill would even be taken up. We've got to have time to bring that bill to the floor of the Senate. We're going to have to work it. I want time to do that. The longer we stall, the closer we get to the next election. If we get to the next election and lose seats in the House of Representatives, Mr. Speaker, this window in the House could close. And then what do they say? They'll say, well, it was our judgment. We wanted to wait until the Supreme Court was ready. It wasn't our fault that the window closed in the House or the Senate or perhaps the presidency. When you have the opportunity to move the agenda, you move the agenda. We have the opportunity to do that. And it is de facto veto power right now that the National Right to Life has because of that arrangement that was put together some years ago that says these top 3 pro-life organizations have to all be in agreement before we're going to move any legislation off the floor of the House. Why would any speaker grant de facto authority to an outside organization, none of whom have been elected in this Republican form of government? Why would that be allowed to trump the will of the people? Why would that have more value than the considered judgment of the vast majority of the Republican majority conference in the House of Representatives? How can we say to any one of those 170, your opinion doesn't matter at all because you don't yet have the unanimous enthusiasm behind the top 3 pro-life organizations in the country? It comes back to National Right to Life, who say, they put out a statement that says, we do not oppose the heartbeat bill. We do not oppose the heartbeat bill. The other side of that coin is, and it's the same coin, we do not support the heartbeat bill. That's the message. That's the message that Speaker Ryan gets, and that's why this bill wasn't on the floor today. It's the blockage that comes from inactivity. And all that needs to happen is David Osteen or Carol Tobias needs to pick up the phone, call Speaker Paul Ryan, call my office if you like, and I'll patch you through, and say, you know what, we want to move it while we got the chance, because the window is open in the House of Representatives. You don't have to do a single thing beyond that. You don't have to whip the bill. You don't have to go visit any members. You don't have to spend a single dime of those hard-earned dollars that are being raised in the pro-life movement, except for the cost of the phone call, and I'll pay for it. Call the Speaker, call Leader McCarthy and say, you know what, we do think it's a good idea. Why, instead of saying we do not oppose, when really it is you do not support, all you have to do is say, let that bill go. Just like Charlton Heston and Moses, let our people go. Let those little babies with heartbeats live. Get a bill out of the House to the Senate, and then let's turn the pressure up in the Senate. It isn't going to happen unless we take the first step, like a little baby that's wobbling and tottering. They learn to walk. They need a chance to get that chance to walk. We need to be able to move the bill off the floor of the House of Representatives. This isn't a stretch for public opinion. The public opinion is with us. A little higher in support of HR 490, the heartbeat bill. It's even a little higher than it is on the 20-week pain-capable one, which has been out there. They've been working it for years, and I respect that and appreciate it. But there isn't some kind of a rule that says you have to struggle for years before your bill can be heard. The strongest and best ideas that have weathered the debate need to come forward and be moved off the floor of the House of Representatives. Here's what it is. 70 members signed on. 170 members signed on. 129 organizations or leaders supporting the bill. I don't know why one group has a veto, a power, a de facto veto authority over this bill. We need a vote on the heartbeat bill, and it's now being blocked because of that inaction. One phone call. Or if they just wanted to post on their website, instead of "we do not oppose the heartbeat bill," just post on there, "we now support the heartbeat bill." God bless them if they'll do that, because things will move. Now this heartbeat bill is the most popular pro-life bill that's pending in the House of Representatives today. And it has been for a long time, for almost this whole Congress. It prevents about 95% of the abortions. And this does push the Senate. It pushes pain capable off of Mitch McConnell's desk and perhaps to the floor of the Senate for a vote. It moves the agenda. It helps the other pieces of legislation as well. Here's the polling, though, Mr. Speaker, that I think should give people some confidence. And that is that all in all, across the spectrum of Democrats, independents, and Republicans, the heartbeat bill as written has 69% of adults all the way across the spectrum. This is a Barna poll that took place last year, but not that long ago. And here's how it breaks down by party, in case people are worried about that. 86% of Republicans support the heartbeat bill, H.R. 490. 55% of Democrats support the heartbeat bill, H.R. 490. A majority of Democrats support the heartbeat bill, 55%, and 61% of independents. And when you put that all together and you match it up for the demographics of the percentages that are Democrats versus independents and Republicans, you merge that together, 69% support the heartbeat bill. That's a little better than the 20-week pain-capable bill. People understand this. That beating heart is in our hearts, and so are these little babies. And I would say to National Right to Life, whose mission statement almost commands them to support the heartbeat bill, you ought to amend your mission statement or support the heartbeat bill. And here's one of their founders. I'll say a founder of the pro-life movement and the founder and former president of National Right to Life, now passed away, sadly, and he surely did his part, Dr. John C. Wilkie. Here's what he had to say, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, "When I founded the pro-life movement, it wasn't to regulate how abortions would be done. It was to bring the abortion killing to an end. We have waited too long, and that wait has cost us too much." Close quote, Dr. John C. Wilkie. Take this back to 1973. The missions there were to end abortion. And yet, we're stuck in a rut of incrementalism, moving a tiny little bit at a time. We've saved 2 million lives in all of this, maybe a few more than 2 million lives, no more. And we watched 60 million babies be aborted. And I'm hearing the argument of, well, we really can't move because the Supreme Court's not ready, and we don't know if there's going to be any retirements in the Supreme Court. I know there'll be retirements in the Supreme Court. I'm certain of it. There'll be that, or there's 3 ways out of the Supreme Court, and those folks that were there 100 years ago aren't there now, so we know there's going to be a change in the court. What we don't know is this court may well uphold heartbeat because it's more precisely written and more carefully drafted, and it answers the right kind of questions. I think it has a better chance of being upheld before the Supreme Court than pain capable. But those who pushed pain capable 20-week didn't have those reservations on their bill, but they seem to wonder about this one and say we shouldn't move heartbeat until we have another appointment to the Supreme Court. How can you let that happen? Well, perhaps the window closes in the House or the Senate or the presidency. Sitting here twiddling our thumbs and watching babies be aborted at a rate of, by the way, I did get this piece from National Right to Life in the conversation just yesterday, that when they began this effort, there were as many as 6 million abortions a year in America. I hadn't heard that number before, and I didn't go back to verify it, but that's what my ear heard yesterday. And that we've now gotten that number down to under 1 million abortions a year. That's considered progress, and it is progress. Then he gave me the exact number, 900 and some thousand abortions last year. I didn't commit that number to memory, but it means something different to me. That's 1 million abortions a year every year. That means in 45 years, we'll have another 45 million abortions on our conscience. And that 60 million abortions for today turns into 105 million abortions if we just double the time span from Roe versus Wade in another 45 years. And to take pride in getting it down to less than a million as if that's a milestone troubles me considerably. And it might not have if I had just only heard it in that context. But I heard it in a different context 4 or 5 months ago, standing over here on the floor, Mr. Speaker. And there's a gentle lady from the Democrat Party who is one who, there are really only a couple of pro-life people over here anymore, so you know that she's not pro-life. But she asked me why I have this heart on my lapel. And I told her it's for the heartbeat bill, H.R. 490. And I want to protect these babies from the moment a heartbeat can be detected, the baby must be protected. And she said, I don't know why you want to do that, Steve. We've got abortions down to under 1 million a year. And I said, I want to save them all. I want to save every single one of them. That's why I'm going to wear this on my lapel till we get this job done. But it was stunning to me that she would say that, even being a pro-choice representative here in the United States House of Representatives. And when I matched that up with almost the same thing from a leader in the National Right to Life, I think we've got to take a fresh look. They're too stuck in their ways. We will never get to the end of abortion if we're married to tiny incrementalism. We have an obligation to take the opportunities that God has given us and the voters have given us and act on them. And I would go to personhood, the moment of conception, and do that in an instant if we could get that done. But we can't define medically and precisely that moment of conception. But we have defined medically and precisely the heartbeat. That's our marker, the heartbeat in that ultrasound. We had a little witness come before the Constitution Subcommittee, which I chair, and held a hearing on the heartbeat bill. And this little guy was the youngest witness to testify in the history of the United States Congress, I believe. And he's an 18-week developed little boy in his mother's womb. And we had the ultrasound sitting next to his mother, but the tape of the ultrasound that they'd taken hours before. This little boy's name is Lincoln Glenn Miller. And that little guy, we showed his ultrasound, and we showed him there in his mother's womb. And we listened to his heartbeat, and his arm was out like this. And I said into the microphone, Lincoln, will you move your arm? And in an instant, he jerked his arm towards his mouth. And I said, Lincoln, can you suck your thumb? And in a moment, he put his thumb in his mouth and began to suck his thumb. And I said, a little bit later, Lincoln, can you talk to us? And you could see his mouth moving as if he's trying to talk. In this ultrasound on the big screen in the United States Congress, in the House Judiciary Committee, Constitution Subcommittee, we watched this little guy, Lincoln Glenn Miller, testify to the humanity of an 18-week developed little child. We know this life begins at the moment of conception. We know that we can precisely define that heartbeat. We know that if you have to check for that heartbeat, it's awfully hard to lie about it when you have to keep the records. We know that it's gotten into our conscience that abortion stops a beating heart. And we all in our mind's ear can hear that rhythm of that beating heart. I used 158 beats per minute. That's what's in my iPhone right now. And I can listen to that little baby as that little baby grows and develops. I want to see all of these babies grow and develop. I want to see every one of them come to birth in full term. I pray that they're mentally healthy and that they're physically healthy. And I don't have any more asks after that. Boys or girls, God, bring them to me in whatever order they might come. But let's get them born, and let's take care of them and nurture them in mind, in body, and in faith, as our founding fathers envisioned when they wrote the language into our Declaration of Independence and prioritized life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. God bless them. Let's do the right thing. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.